If you take a look at the book of Ruth, there's two characters in particular that they shine a massive spotlight on. That being Ruth, well, three really. Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi. The three of which they put on a pedestal, explaining their life and showing everything, showing everything that they did throughout their time, and what about it made their life so Christ-like, and what about it made everything so meaningful. And so they put them almost on a pedestal of sorts, and that pedestal raises them higher than two of the other characters in the Bible, two that I actually took more notice of than the three, that being Orpah and the close relative. And now the reason I took notice of the two is you can pull a lot from just the few lines that they were in that hold a lot of hidden meaning, per se. For instance, in this book, they mentioned, in the video specifically, they mentioned Orpah in a line. A single line, Orpah is introduced and then immediately exits. She doesn't persist any past that part of the book. In the book, if you actually read through the book, she stays for about a chapter. She's not in there very long. She's mentioned, she's talked about, and she talks about how she didn't want to leave, and then she wept over it and eventually decided that it was best for her to go back to Moab. At which point she does. She travels back to Moab. And in the video specifically, it skips over a few of the details and just says she goes back. Now you can take this one of two ways. The first being that Orpah wasn't a religious woman. She wasn't a Christian, or at the time, a Jew. She wasn't a believer in the faith of Israel. And so that's why she went back to Moab. And if you followed just in the video, it would highlight that specifically and tell you pretty much that, yeah, no, she didn't want anything to do with Israel. She wanted to go back to Moab. That's her home. She doesn't really care about it. Her husband's dead. Why should she go there? If you go back and read through the details of the book, it actually tells you how she regretted leaving Naomi. And so it gives you kind of conflicting personalities. It gives you the Orpah who is kind and loyal just as Ruth was and just chose the other option. But it also gives you the Orpah that wasn't listening to God. And if you take a step back and look at it, I believe those two main characters give you a more relatable story to us as a person than Ruth and Boaz do. If you look at Orpah and you look at the close relative, they're said in passing. They're mentioned once, they're kicked out of the story. They were used to push the plot along, per se. But it was never just a name tossed around. It wasn't just a person. They didn't add her because it sounded better. They added her because we're Orpah. We're the close relative. We're the person who isn't put on the pedestal. Our story doesn't get told to thousands of people over and over again. Our story isn't highlighted as one of the most Christ-like books in the Bible. Our story doesn't show how we lived this amazing life and God loved us and provided for us. We don't have that story. That doesn't go out to the major populace of the world. We're Orpah. We're the person who decided to stay in Moab. Not because God told us to go to Israel, but because God told us to stay in Moab. We're the one who listened to God in a sense that we weren't put on display. We weren't the one to be looked at by millions. We weren't the one to be used as an example, but he still uses her. And so her one word, her one line in that one book carries so much weight that it's astounding. You can relate to her on a more personal level than you can Ruth. Because none of us have lived a perfect life. And to be completely honest, in my perspective, I wouldn't go into a foreign land. I don't even believe I would move across seas at this point in my life, and it's not a hostile territory. If I move over to Europe, I'm not going to be persecuted for being a Christian, but I still don't want to move. And so it just shows you how Orpah relates to us on a more personal level. And it shows you the day-to-day choices that you have to make. That being Orpah and Ruth's day-to-day choice. It wasn't some big climax of events. That wasn't the total sum of their life. That was just a yes or no question that was asked to them at some point during their life that they probably won't even remember the exact date. It was a yes or no question that we get all the time. That's the difference between us saying, yeah, sure, I'll go to Greenville with you, why not? Or, no, I think I'd rather stay home. Or, why don't we move to Winterville? Or why don't we move to Kinston? Those questions that to us are big, but to the majority of the populace wouldn't matter. It's a one-line question that they just know the answer of, where it doesn't mean anything to them, but to us it means the world. And it just gives you that example to not underestimate the mundane things of life. To not take things that you would normally associate as secular and separate them from God. And that's kind of where popcorn comes in all of this. So before we delve in a little bit too deep, before I lose you, I'm going to give you some information on popcorn, background per se. Popcorn is a rather simple thing. Most people don't really think about it. Toss it in the microwave, it pops, you got it, good. Who actually knows what popcorn consists of? What's inside of it, other than the fact that you can read it now? Who knows what it is? It's okay, you can pull it back up. So a kernel of popcorn, while very simple, isn't as what everybody can always assume it to be. We can't actually make popcorn from the corn that we actually see in the fields. It isn't made from the same corn. It's a particular species of corn that they grow specifically for popcorn. And that kernel is dried out, and that kernel specifically expels moisture. Inside of the kernel, there is a hard starch and oil and water. 3 parts inside of the kernel in total. And when the kernel reaches 135 psi, well, 180 degrees Celsius, 356 degrees Fahrenheit, the kernel actually pops. That's when you get the popcorn. It actually boils the oil and water into a pressurized steam until it can't hold it anymore and it just explodes. So, in this, you can kind of pull from and create a sort of visual to our day-to-day lives. Let's say you take a kernel, and we say each kernel represents a choice, a small thing in our life, a small decision, a small yes or no question. And that kernel creates a trail. There's multiple kernels in a day, and the kernel leads to the next day, and then the next day, and then the next day. And each one pops once you've decided, once it's culminated, once it's come to a conclusion. Each kernel eventually pops, and you get the popcorn. So that kernel represents our everyday tasks of life. And if you take the inside of the kernel, if you look at it, it's not just one part, it's 3 parts. That can be represented to the Chinese God, the 3 parts of God. But for this instance, I'm actually going to represent it to us, God, and the stress and hardships of life. Us being the water, the simplicity, the major part inside of it. The stress being the hard starch, the hardships of life, caught between you and a hard place. The no's, the frustration, the aggravation, the anger, whatever comes out of those decisions that culminates and just infuriates you because of how hard this decision was or how infuriating it was. And the oil, well, God. And so that combination of you and God and the hardships he puts in front of you and that the answers he has you make, the questions he gives you, the barriers he puts in front of you, the walls he gives you for you to plow through. That's where the culmination of all 3 come together, and that's how you create the popcorn. So once the oil and the water heat up to a certain degree, once you reach the same level that God wants you to be at for that catalyst, for that explosion, for that culmination, you have to reach the certain point. You have to come to God. God's at the level. He wants you to get to him. That's where you get the PSI. That's where you get the degrees Celsius. That's where you have to get to a certain point for God to be like, okay, you made it. Pop. So you get to that temperature. You get to that pressure. And then God takes all that hardship, all that pain, all that suffering, all the infuriating moments, all the sleepless nights, and turned it from something that was originally unusable into crispy popcorn, something that you're satisfied with, something that gives you a sense of satisfaction and makes it, okay, so it wasn't worth nothing. It was, I can see why this happened. I can understand it. It gives me a sense of satisfaction. And that's what creates this sense of success in our life. These small moments that are otherwise mundane, otherwise not related to God, secular things that keep us trudging on through life. You hear the words clinical depression tossed around a lot. And in a sense, the popcorn method, the popcorn theory is the reason why you're able to not fall into depression, why you're able to keep chugging on, why you still do things in life. It's because you find little bits of satisfaction along the way, small choices, small decisions, whatever your hobbies may be, those are your popcorn. And some people have actually figured this out and almost boiled it down to a science per se. In a sense, I'll give you the most relatable thing to me would be video games. One video game in particular uses the popcorn method in everything that it does, that being Call of Duty. Everyone's probably heard of it. From a gamer's perspective, it is a terrible game. Everything about it. It is constantly repetitive. There's very little variation in the game. The challenge of actually playing it is very mundane. It doesn't take a lot of skill. And to play at a decent level on the video game, it takes like a culmination of a week of practice. It's a very, very simple game. But the reason why it's so successful is because of what it does to make you think you like it, what it makes you feel successful, it gives you that sense of accomplishment. So in Call of Duty, there's progression. You have levels. Every level you get, that's a popcorn. 1, 2, 3, all the way up to the cap. And then as soon as you hit the cap, there's a button that says you can restart. Now, if we take that out of the game, and we put that in life, you took it step by step. You get to the point, let's say you were building something. You bought the material, you cut the material, you put it together, you nailed it all together. Frustration, cut your hands, hammers your finger. It's not perfect. You get to the point where you finally get the final piece of work. Would you tear it down and start it? In that game, you want to. In some way, shape, form, or fashion, they have created a sense of accomplishment in that game that you start from bare nothing and start all over again. Not only do you once, do it 10 times. Some games 15. And that's why they become so successful, because they've created these kernels of popcorn in every little bit of the game, unlocking a new gun, unlocking a new attachment, getting a new level that makes you want to play it, even though you don't like it. Needless to say, I stopped playing it. But that's where the popcorn theory takes place, and it's something that you can see visibly, where they take something that isn't that great, but because of the small sense of satisfaction you get out of it, you love it.
Yes.
And so that kind of brings us to that candy trail of success, the kernels of success that gives you that small, very satisfying achievement. And it creates in you this feeling of accomplishment. It makes you want to continue moving on, and it makes you want to pull more from it. Now we can find parallels of that in our life. In video games, it's video game achievements, small little tasks, small little bits and pieces, stuff that you like, stuff that makes you feel good, and all digital, you never keep it in. In life, it's stuff a little more meaningful, something a little more solid, something you can actually hold. Promotions, raises, you get a new TV, you get a new chair, you get a new couch. Just small things where you've been working 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week, however long you work a week. You've been slaving through it, you've been feeling terrible, you hate your job, nobody wants to go to work, but that's the reason why you do it. I get this nice house, or I have this nice TV, I have these nice things. I get to do this, or we get to go out on Saturdays, we get to go to baseball games, we get to go watch football. You get to do what you want to do in life. That's where you get to pick and choose your kernels. And so life gives you this bag of popcorn. And it tells you to pop the popcorn, you gotta sit through the pain. You gotta wait. You gotta watch it pop. You gotta let it pop. And then you get to choose what popcorn you get. You get to pick the pieces. You get to choose which ones are gonna pop. You have to sit through life. You have to get an education. You have to get the job you want. You have to go through the training of the job. You have to work 40-hour weeks. And then things start popping. You get a house. You get a family. You get kids. Then you have hobbies. Let's say, for instance, you collect shoes. Let's say you wear a lot of clothes and you go to the clothes and you get tons of clothes because you have the money to get clothes now. Or you're like me and you build PCs. Just bought a $700 PC that's sitting in my house waiting for me to build. But that's the kernels of popcorn. That's what gives you satisfaction in life. That's what makes you keep moving on. It goes because you're not looking at this long walk. You're not looking at the end where you have a full bowl of popcorn. You're looking at the kernels. That's not so far. I'll give it this one. It pops. You get what you need. Oh, there's another one. And another one. And another one. And another one. And another until you're almost there. And you just keep going until you reach that culmination. That where you can look back and you see all of the kernels you left behind, everything you've done, and you look at it and it's just like, wow. I've come this far. I've done this much. I've done all of this. And the reason that you got there is that satisfaction it gives you. And you can take that satisfaction and you can apply it to everything in life. And this is where God comes in. Because just buying shoes, just buying clothes, buying games, buying electronics, keeping up to date on technology, whatever it is you do, that's not necessarily separated from God. That's something God's put in your life. That's something that God knows you like. That's something God knows you want. And God knows that's something that gives you that sense of accomplishment. And so that's where these mundane things of life, these things that you would assume are completely separated from God, aren't. He's placed each one of those kernels. He knows how far you'll be able to make it until you get that next one. He knows just how many you need to get to the end. He knows which kernel is going to want you to go further. And he knows just how far he can push you until he pops the next one. And so it just takes all of this perspective of life, the jobs, the hardship, the friendships, the pain, the loss of relationships, loss of friends, whatever it is that you lose in life that culminates that kernel popping. It's not mundane. It's not separated from God. God's there the whole time because he uses that sense of accomplishment to get you to his end goal. Amen. He gives you those things in life so that you won't stop and that you won't veer off the path. So take a look at your life. Find out what kernels are yours. Find out what you know makes you tick, what gets you to that next pop. And find out how God's put that in your life. Whether it's putting a certain friend in your life, whether it's you meeting a certain person, whether you found this hobby that you love to do and you're just edging until you get to the point where you can finally build it again, or you can finally buy the next thing for the hobby, or you can continue your collection, whatever it is. Figure out how God's put that in your life so that you don't take the Monday through Saturday as without God. Amen. And so that you see God everywhere. In the things you buy and the things you do and the people you talk to. God puts everything in this ridiculously elaborate algorithm and creates the path for you to take. Amen. And that's where he becomes unimaginable. Because what it would take to measure up one person, what they like, what they dislike, the furthest they can push them to breaking point without breaking, and how to get them to an end goal without them realizing they're getting to an end goal. To do one person is ridiculous. To do the entire world, so find your kernels, wait for them to pop, and understand that God's with you every step of the way.
Amen. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, I'm not going to try to top that.
I know that's right.
But what I'm going to tell you is this
Yes.
is food for thought. That whether you realize it or not, what he does is to stretch us. What do you mean? I mean that if my son does his job well, I'm going to be uncomfortable.
All right.
That's right.
All right.
That's right.
That's his job.
Mhm.
Why do I say that? I say this because the average decade that most churches live in is 1950s. That there are churches that have not
That's right.
changed the way they approach the
That's right.
gospel,
Exactly.
the way they give the gospel, and the things that they do in the service. I do not believe they got there overnight.
Amen.
I believe it got to the
Right.
place that they tried to choose the comfortable route. And so as I'm sitting there this morning, there are a lot of things I would have done differently, but thank God I was not the one called to do the service. And when I saw the things that he introduced, I said, you know what? He's doing his job. Because if he's doing his job, we're not going to look 10 years from now or wherever we start looking back and saying we've remained the same.
Right.
But there was a stretching that was taking place.
That's right.
My words can't properly address how proud I am of him this morning. And the kids, oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
yeah.
McKenna and Yana, wow. Same thing with Colin
That's
and
right.
Michael. They did something they've never done before.
That's
And
right.
I
That's
think almost Colin enjoyed himself this morning.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm going to pay for it tomorrow, I can already see. But I think he almost enjoyed himself this morning. Imagine that, coming to church and enjoying yourself. I like the illustration.
Yes.
I like what God's doing.
Yes.
And we're blessed, folks.
Yes.
Keep stretching us. Keep stretching us. And so that you know, I don't know what he's going to do.
That's right.
In fact, very few know what he's going to do. And he does that on that way on purpose, I guess. My job is to support him. As I hope that you're going to support him as well. Because it looked good to see the kids involved, actively involved this morning.
Amen.
Are our hearts and minds clear this morning? Well, let's stand. Jennifer, would you come forward this morning?